the wealth behind America's most powerful families, built on opium, addiction, and millions of lives destroyed in China. For generations, the names Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard, and Cabot have been presented as pillars of American prestige, symbols of refinement, philanthropy, and leadership. Yet behind the polished statues and glowing biographies lies a secret nearly erased from the historical record. These families, institutions, and dynasties built the foundations of their wealth the same way, by pumping massive quantities of opium into China, addicting millions, draining the nation's silver reserves, and quietly transforming drug profits into American respectability. The scale was staggering. Industrial amounts of narcotics sold at 400% profits, while the victims numbered in the millions. And for nearly 2 centuries, they ensured this story stayed buried. One of the most shocking examples sits on Mount Rushmore. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, celebrated for guiding the United States through the Great Depression and World War II, was raised on a fortune rooted in opium smuggling. His grandfather, Warren Delano Sioux, spent years in China as a key partner in Russell & Company, the largest American opium trafficking firm of its time. While Chinese communities were ravaged by addiction and death, Delano returned to America immensely wealthy, enough to build mansions, endow his family for generations, and guarantee that his descendants, FDR included, would live in privilege. Ironically, decades later, FDR would become one of the presidents who helped expand federal drug criminalization in America, despite the fact that his own family's fortune originated from the exact trade he would later condemn. Yet the Delanos were far from alone. The Astors, often introduced as fur traders and real estate visionaries, made a large portion of their early fortune by sending their ships to China loaded with Turkish opium. It was the opium profits that allowed John Jacob Astor to become the richest man in America, financing the empire that would eventually include the Waldorf, Astoria Hotel, and countless cultural institutions. The Forbes family followed a similar path long before Forbes magazine existed. The family patriarchs Robert Bennett Forbes and John Murray Forbes used opium voyages to amass wealth they later invested into American railroads and industries. Their descendants inherited not only wealth but social status built on the trade that devastated China for decades. Boston's venerable Perkins family, celebrated for their philanthropy and civic leadership, also owed their wealth to the opium trade. Thomas Handicid Perkins, one of the most revered businessmen in New England, ran opium from Turkey and India to China for years. His money later funded schools, hospitals, and the prestigious Perkins School for the Blind. Even Yale University's Skull and Bones owes its origins to opium profits. The powerful Russell family, whose relative Samuel Russell founded Russell & Company, used part of their fortune to establish the secret society that would later produce presidents, CIA directors, and senators. The pattern repeats with families like the Cabots of Boston, the Lows of New York, and many others whose names still adorn buildings at America's most elite universities. To understand how these families got so rich, you have to understand the mechanics of the opium trade. In the early 1800s, Britain faced a dilemma. They wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But China didn't want British goods. Silver drained from British treasuries at an unsustainable rate. The solution was brutally simple. Sell opium grown in British, controlled India into China, even though it was illegal there. American merchants quickly joined in, because their clipper ships were faster, making them ideal for outrunning Chinese authorities. Opium purchased cheaply in India could be sold in China at 4 to 5 times the cost. The risk of execution for smugglers existed, but the rewards were so enormous that families like the Delanos, Astors, Forbeses, and Perkinses considered it a worthwhile gamble. American ships rarely entered Chinese ports directly. Instead, they anchored offshore, where Chinese middlemen would row out, exchange silver for opium, and transport the drugs inland. This arrangement allowed American traders to maintain the appearance of staying within the law while still reaping massive profits. The trade grew so huge that by the 1830s, American firms controlled around 10% of all opium entering China. Russell and Company alone moved thousands of chests of opium annually, each chest carrying around 140 pounds. This was industrial-scale drug trafficking, not isolated smuggling. The devastation in China was profound. By the 1830s, estimates suggest that between 10 and 12 million Chinese, roughly 10% of the adult male population, were addicted. The country's silver reserves bled away to pay foreign drug dealers. The Chinese government desperately tried to stop the trade, culminating in Commissioner Lin Zexu's famous decision to seize and destroy 100,000 tons of opium in 1839. Britain responded not with negotiation, but with war. The First Opium War forced China to accept humiliating treaties, open its ports, cede Hong Kong, and effectively tolerate British and American opium trafficking. A decade later, when China again resisted, Britain and France launched the Second Opium War, pushing opium into full legalization within China. Throughout all this bloodshed, American merchants profited immensely. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the men who had grown wealthy by poisoning China quietly reinvented themselves as philanthropists, industrialists, and patrons of America's elite institutions. They endowed universities, funded museums, built hospitals, and established family trusts that still exist. And in doing so, they erased the record of how their fortunes began. Today, official histories gloss over the opium connection or omit it entirely. Yale mentions Samuel Russell as a benefactor, but says nothing of the source of his money. Harvard's Cabot House never acknowledges the Cabot family's involvement in the opium trade. The Forbes and Astor families highlight their philanthropy and business achievements, but leave their opium dealings in the shadows. Even the FDR Presidential Library barely hints at the Delano connection. What makes this erasure even more disturbing is that the same elite families who once profited from addicting millions later championed harsh drug laws for everyone else. After gaining legitimacy, wealth, and political power, they supported anti-opium campaigns and helped push national drug prohibition in the early 20th century. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 and other early drug laws were promoted by politicians and institutions whose own fortunes originated in the narcotics they now criminalized. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. In China, the memory of the opium era remains vivid. It is taught in schools as part of the century of humiliation, the period when Western powers used addiction, war, and economic coercion to subjugate the nation. Every Chinese student learns that British and American merchants flooded their country with narcotics for profit. In America, by contrast, the episode is barely mentioned. Most Americans have no idea that many of their country's wealthiest families and most prestigious universities were funded in part by the suffering of millions of Chinese people. The truth is uncomfortable but undeniable. Some of America's most respected families, names still associated with power and influence, built their fortunes through one of the largest drug trafficking operations in world history. They then used their wealth to sanitize their reputation, rewrite their history, and criminalize the very trade that made them rich. Confronting that truth forces us to re-examine the origins of American wealth, the institutions we admire, and the narratives we were taught to believe. If this changes the way you see American history, you're not alone. And if you want more untold stories like this, stories buried, forgotten, or deliberately erased, stick around. There is much more to uncover.